Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and today we are very fortunate to have with us Bryan Caplan. He's a professor of economics at George Mason University. He's been published on numerous formats, including the American Economic Review, the Economic Journal, and the Journal of Law and Economics. He's also authored numerous books, including the one he's here to discuss today, a graphic novel called Build, Baby Build, The Science and Ethics of Housing Regulation. Professor Caplan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks a lot. And by the way, here's the book.
Awesome. So I have to ask, why make the case in this format of a graphic novel?
Great question. Comes down to this. There's fantastic, deep, meaningful, high quality research on housing regulation that is so boring, almost no one on earth will ever read it. I'm trying to figure out a way to take what is known and communicate it to a broader audience in a way that makes people realize how much is at stake and what it really means. This isn't just one particular kind of regulation that happens to exist. Say, really, this is the regulation that, in terms of domestic policy, is doing more than any other regulation to lock the world of the present in place and prevent the emergence of a much better world of the future. Also, I should say, another reason why I did it this way is that I think a lot of the actual support for regulation is based purely on aesthetics. I don't like the way this new thing will look. So I thought the graphic format would allow me to show people an alternate reality of what could have been and say, look at it. You don't have to speculate about what it look like. I'm showing you, my artist drew it. Now you can still tell me that it's too ugly to build. I don't think so.
It's actually a very fun book to read because you're a character in the book and you're having conversations with various opponents of deregulation and professors and economists and writers who are advocates. It's very entertaining.
Long dead heroes.
Yes. So what are some of the ways, I state your fundamental thesis, at least what I think it is that housing costs are high because of regulation, and the solution is deregulation. Would that be accurate?
Yep, that's beautiful. Key caveat is that the severity of the regulation depends upon what part of the country that you're in. But a nice way of putting it is that there is heavy regulation in virtually everywhere a lot of people live. Okay. If you want to build in the middle of nowhere, you could probably do what you want, but people don't want to live in the middle of nowhere. So what good is it?
And why does regulation cause prices to rise?
All right. Well, you just need to take a look at the kinds of regulations that you have and then to get an idea about what's going on. One of the simplest ones is that it's very hard to build skyscrapers. Technologically, we have the ability to go and let an enormous number of people live in the very most desirable addresses on Earth just by putting them in vertically. You could have cheap, spacious apartments in downtown Manhattan and San Francisco if it were legal, but governments generally say, no, you're not allowed to do that. Multifamily housing. Normally, it is illegal to build anything other than a single family house in most residential areas. Even when you're only allowed to build single family homes, there's still further regulations saying you need to waste most of your land. You got to put one house on every acre, whereas the builders probably want to do more like 4 or 6 houses on every acre. You put all this together and you are basically strangling the natural response of the market to high prices. Here's the key thing to remember about how markets work. In the short run, as we all know, rising demand means that prices go up. There's some supply response, but in the short run, more demand means higher prices. But there's a deeper long-run effect going on, which is that when prices go up, this means that you have temporarily raised prices above average cost. And anytime that there's an industry where prices are above average cost, this is basically like a giant announcement to the business world, calling all cars. You can make money just by producing this product using normal standard techniques. You don't have to be special or original, just replicate, copy, paste what is normally done in this industry, and you will make a profit. Once this happens, the normal thing is you get a lot of entry and people keep entering until finally you have so much extra supply that prices are driven back down to average cost. This is the way that most markets work. It's the way that housing markets used to work, but starting around the 70s or the 80s, regulation got to be so tight that the market has not been able to keep up, especially in your most desirable locations.
Now, you make a very compelling case for deregulation bringing down costs. So, why don't people buy it? Why are so many people? There's a multitude of reasons, but
Mm-hmm.
just share some of them. I mean, the parking you're going to lose, traffic congestion. Just take us through some of the objections, the character of the
Mm-hmm.
neighborhood that people have, and why they're basically wrong.
Yeah, so the most fundamental problem, as I talk about in the last chapter, is about 2/3 of Americans just deny that there's any connection between housing supply and the price of housing. The level of economic illiteracy is that severe that if you say, let us build a lot more, prices will go down, a majority of Americans say, no, it won't. About a third say prices will go up. A third say nothing. Only about a third give the right answer. It's basically at the level of chance. When people are that crazy, it's like the level of you can't sell your lemonade at a lemonade stand and someone says, let's cut the price. And you go, oh no, I'm not going to fall for that one. It's not ideology, it's science, it's common sense. I'd say that's the most fundamental issue. If someone just denies that allowing industry to build more housing, reduce prices, then nothing else that I say in the book will really make much sense to you. But why does the regulation exist? I think the regulation exists because normal human beings believe the world would be a lot worse without it. It's not primarily self-interest because tenants support this regulation too. People that have no dog in the fight, just a random stranger passing through town, they hear about a group of people trying to stop a new development. The normal reaction is, good for you, you're standing up for the little guy. That's this kind of stuff. So this is the reason why people favor regulation. They think the world will be worse without it. And what do I have to say about that? First of all, some of the problems that they're talking about are genuine. I just think that they're overstated. They're ignoring other solutions rather than just strangling housing. And finally, and this is probably the most important one, is people only want to talk about negatives. They don't want to talk about positives. All right, so let's go through each of those in turn. All right, so first of all, there are some genuine problems. Yeah, when you let more people live in your area, parking and driving will get worse. All right, so that's true. You let someone build a skyscraper, it'll block somebody's life. That's true. All right, so there's that. But there are just much cheaper ways of handling the big problems, like with parking and driving. You could charge people for parking and driving based upon the conditions that they are parking and driving in, instead of just saying you can't build anything. Right. There was an earlier time when having time varying tolls or time varying parking prices would have been technologically difficult. But now, yeah, you've seen these before, Michael?
I have, yes.
Now we've got technology that makes it so easy to do it, but most people are remain totally resistant to charging people, and especially to charging a different price based on conditions. So you have to pay more when it's busy. So there's that. But I think the really big issue is just this extreme negativity bias where people only want to talk about negatives. They don't want to talk about positives, even though we have hard evidence that in general, the positives outweigh the negatives of construction. How do we know this? Well, take a look at any misanthropic, negative person living in, say, New York City or any other major metropolis. And what are they going to say? Oh, it's terrible to live here. There's parking, there's traffic, there's noise, blah, blah, blah. It's like, all right, you could move to an uninhabited part of the country. Your rent will go down a lot, and other people will never bother you again. Why not? The answer, obviously, is that people get a lot of value out of living near other people. There's better restaurants, more shopping, better jobs. There are places for your kids to go to school. Your kids can have friends. You can have friends. All of these good things barely get mentioned whenever someone is talking about new construction. And yet, how do we know that the package of good plus bad is a positive? Because people voluntarily pay a lot of money to live near all these other people. While it's true that regulation has really jacked up the price of housing in, say, New York City, if people didn't like New York City, that wouldn't have worked. Regulation can't jack up the price of living in the middle of Siberia because nobody wants to live there. So there's no demand, and you can regulate all you want. It won't change anything. Regulation works when you combine a desirable location with the refusal to allow more construction so more people can enjoy that desirable location.
You talk about the bias that people have for what is as opposed to what
Mm-hmm.
might be. In Connecticut, where I live, the Republicans who are supposed to be, and I know it's laughable, the small government party, but by and large, they support zoning, and they do so, and it drives me absolutely out of my wits when they
Mm-hmm.
say it's a property rights issue. That's why
Mm-hmm.
they support zoning. And what they mean by property rights is I have the right to have my neighborhood be the way that I want.
Yes.
Somebody
Whole
else doesn't
neighborhood.
have the right on their property
Mm-hmm.
to, build a
Mm-hmm.
skyscraper or whatever.
Yeah, it's the same idea of Uber should be illegal because it violates the property rights of taxi cab license owners.
Exactly. So how do you overcome that
Mm-hmm.
sort of, and you give an excellent example with Frederick Bastiat, by the way, with the
Mm-hmm.
seen and the unseen. But it seems that oftentimes it's just talking in the wind because people just don't
Mm-hmm.
buy it. But
Mm-hmm.
what would be your elevator pitch
Mm-hmm.
to overcome that recency bias?
I mean, if it's, well, here's the thing. So if it's really
Not
someone
recency,
who,
I
if
mean
someone is
bias to what is.
genuinely making this property rights argument, then I think you could have a Socratic dialogue and say, well, you don't think that the federal government has a property right in the current taxes, right? You wouldn't say that if we cut taxes, we're robbing the government of their property, would you? All right. Or what about other regulations that you want to get rid of? You wouldn't say that just because someone will suffer if you get rid of the regulation that we should stop it. So why this one? My thing is probably the property rights argument isn't the real issue. It's more like we are the Republican representatives of the suburban voters, and suburban voters don't want to have deregulation. So we're going to stand by the people that have our backs. And that's where it's like, all right, well, but it's really just comes down to you want to get reelected, right? It's not actually sincere. And so in that case, I would say, look, here's how. It's not really that I need to sell you, it's that I need to help you sell what we both agree on to the people that are your supporters. And that's where I would say, look, there are a lot of regulations that are bad for suburban homeowners. Really are. Anytime that you are stopping people from selling out to developer, you are actually impoverishing that person. Anytime that you are keeping prices so high that your kids can't afford to live near you, that's a problem. And it's a problem for the actual people that you already know. Now, in terms of trying to get over this more general issue of status quo bias, opposing almost any change, assuming that the change will be worse, a lot of the reason why I did this book as a graphic novel, like I said, is just to try to help people to visualize an alternative world. Say, look, yes, we can imagine it being worse, but is that a reasonable forecast, or isn't it more reasonable to think it's going to look really cool? I've got a part in the book. Let's see, I might even be able to call it right up here. Yes, I can. Let's see, am I allowed to share here?
Sure.
Could you enable the sharing so I can show them this page from the book?
I'll
Yeah, if you
try.
go
I
down
don't.
to
Oh,
share,
share.
if you go down to share, I think there's a little button that says allow multiple sharing.
Okay, I'm very non-tech savvy. So
All
there's a
right. So if you go
share.
down to the bottom, we can edit this out. If you go down to the bottom, you see share,
I see share
and
screen.
then you'll see, I think you'll see like a little arrow sign next to
Yep.
it. Okay. And you click on that. And if it says allow multiples, you see that? Allow
Um,
other people to share.
share sound, basic, advanced, files,
No,
apps.
no, no, no. So this is actually in the center. It's where there's the green arrow that says up in the center, share.
I hit that already. I hit the share. It says share screen.
Right, but you see that there's a little clip that or like a little extra arrow right next to that button.
Oh, yes.
Okay, and that should say multiple.
Okay. Yep.
See, you see it now?
Yep. I hit it.
All right, great. All right, so now we'll pretend this didn't happen. All right, let
Okay.
me just show you one of my favorite pages from the book here. All right, so let's see, here we are. All right, this is it. All right, so the top is me driving on the California coast with Frederick Bastiat. Take a look. It's nice, right? It's the unspoiled coastline of California. Next panel. It's exactly the same coastline, except now it's been developed.
Yes.
I say it looks better. And this is true about the most famous and beloved coastlines on earth. If you go to the Amalfi Coast of Italy, yeah, it's gorgeous nature, but it's gorgeous nature combined with wonderful, creative, historic lovely human developments that are integrated with the nature. So a lot of what I try to do in the book is to say, instead of just imagining the worst, let me go and draw you some pictures of what it could look like. You could say, all right, well, you can't prove it's going to look like that. But I think that the objection's aesthetic, and if you can get over the aesthetic objection by just showing some other aesthetics. Let's see, I got some more here. Let's see, what do we got this here? So here we got your strictly zoned neighborhood. Here we've got your mixed use neighborhood. Here's free roads. Here's someone who can zip through traffic because the tolls have freed up a lot of spaces, gotten people to go and drive at other times, which means that you can drive at speed limit and the road doesn't have to be a parking lot at rush hour.
That principle in economics, the seen and unseen, to me is one of the most powerful concepts that I've ever come across. Between that and Leonard E. Reed's I pencil are just two very simple concepts that really help to convey powerful truths. Now, you point out these collateral benefits to housing deregulation. I'm a big fan of housing deregulation, but I have to admit, even I've read a little bit about this. I've never thought of some of the things that you talked about in terms of crime, in terms of inequality. What's going on there? Tell us about that, how crime goes down and inequality goes down.
If all that I could say in my book was deregulation reduce housing prices a lot, I probably wouldn't have written the book because it's just not enough to sustain a narrative. What got me motivated is I just started reading about non-obvious side benefits of deregulation that, when you think about them, they're pretty obvious, and yet almost no one talks about them, often for problems that people consider to be individually insoluble. And then I can say, look, not only are they not individually insoluble, I've got one package of policy reforms that will simultaneously make a big dent in a whole lot of problems. So the equality one's really obvious. Housing is what economists call a necessity. Rich people spend a smaller share of their income on housing than poor people. Therefore, if you can just reduce the price across the board, the percentage gain of the poor exceeds the percentage gain to the rich, which is the definition of reducing inequality. So yes, a lot of the reason why inequality has risen turns out to be nothing to do with free markets. It's just government strangling housing supply so that this basic necessity is getting harder and harder for lower income people to afford. In the book, I talk about this really cool paper by Matt Ronley. He wrote it when he was a grad student. You might remember Thomas Piketty's book Capital, which has all the stuff about how, there's a natural tendency for unregulated capitalism to give you more and more inequality, because all you have to do if you're rich is to go and invest your capital in the market. And if the interest rate exceeds the rate of economic growth, the share of the rich inevitably rises, blah, blah, blah. All right. So anyway, this was his story, got a lot of attention for it. And then Matt Ronley just got his data and said, wait a second. It's not even true that capital, in the sense that most people think about it, has gained in its income share over this period since World War II. Really, what happened is that housing gets counted as capital. And housing share has risen a lot because, of course, of regulation, where you strangle off supply so that if you happen to get lucky and buy a townhome in San Francisco in 1970, you're now worth 10 million bucks. Right. And that's the actual story. You mentioned crime. So this is one where, again, it's quite non-obvious, but until you think about it. So fact, a large share of urban land is vacant. So the article that I cited said something like 15% of urban land is vacant. There's just nothing there. It's like, that's weird. Why not? And I'm like, well, yeah, because of regulation. If you have a vacant lot and you're allowed to build something on it, you're probably going to build something on it. It stays vacant sometimes because you think something better is going to happen, but mainly because your hands are tied. The government won't let you do anything. So it's like, all right, what am I going to do? I'll sit there and hope eventually someone more friendly to me gets elected. The observation of the authors of the paper that I cite was that these vacant lots routinely become centers of crime, right? You're not going to go and do crime in the mall or make that your place where you're going to do it. You're going to get in trouble. You go to a vacant lot, nobody's around, and that you can sort of take over it. You squat there, and that becomes a center for gang activity. What was cool in this paper is that they managed to get the city of Philadelphia to allow them to beautify a random half of all the lots. This is the kind of thing that you do when you want to get gold standard evidence, hard proof that something works. Of course, we do this normally with drugs, where we give half of all people the real drug and half of them a placebo, and then you compare the difference in health. The idea here is we'll randomly go and beautify half the lots. We'll clean up the trash, we'll plant trees, grass, picket fence, some benches, basically turn half of the vacant lots into little parks, and the other half we'll just leave them as the dumps they are. And then we'll come back and measure crime. And what they found was that it did make a significant dent in crime. Funny thing about this paper, they went out of their way to say, we're not talking about building anything. That would be gentrification. That's bad. All we're doing is just putting in some little parks. It's like, why are you trying to avoid saying the obvious conclusion, which is that if just planting some grass cuts crime, allowing someone to build some apartments would cut crime a lot more?
Well, yeah, I mean, when I was committing crimes as a kid, I would have no problem going onto somebody's grass, but going into somebody's house
Yeah.
is a much more difficult endeavor. You know, you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned Piketty, and it seems to me like between Thomas Piketty and Alan Kruger with the minimum wage stuff,
Mm-hmm.
it's like those are the guys that the left just insist on constantly
Mm-hmm.
mentioning as the grand refuters of capitalism. But when
Mm-hmm.
you look into it, it turns out they haven't actually refuted anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Card and Kruger minimum wage stuff, I think, is much higher quality than the Piketty stuff.
Wow.
The Piketty stuff is just ridiculous. As people have pointed out, look, it would only, like, for it to work. Even this idea that you're rich, you have some capital, you sit on it, earn interest, and get richer and richer. You just need to have one descendant that squanders his inheritance, and then you're back to square
Yeah.
zero. So it's just a terrible story. And also, like if you have more than one kid, you're splitting the inheritance, and then that changes the math. The Card and Kruger papers. I actually was a student of David Card, and I knew Alan Kruger before he died. I've presented those papers. The main complaints against them that people have are based upon not having read the papers. I think the papers are ultimately not very convincing, but the main issue comes down to, if you just start off by saying, what happens when you raise the minimum wage? It could, the amount of people hired could go up, could go down, could be the same. Who knows? I have no opinion. I'm a blank slate. If that's where you start, then the papers seem okay. But would you believe a paper like this on the quantity of asparagus that people buy?
I
Like,
wouldn't believe it
no.
on anything.
Yes.
No.
Yeah. So I'd say, look, on all of these things, the reasonable thing to do is to start with a very strong common sense view that raising prices reduces the quantity people want to buy. And then, based upon the evidence, you may tweak that confidence a bit, and you should, but not that much. And it's important to notice that no one, regardless of their political views, believes this kind of stuff for any issue they actually care about. So, like, if you were to go and say, oh, it turns out that raising the punishment for pollution increases pollution, are environmentalists going to go and say, oh my God, in that case, we need to reduce the punishments on pollution to get less pollution? They're going to say, no way, there's something wrong. And that's the way that I think is going on, is there's some people that just want to go and have a minimum wage in defiance of common sense, and therefore they will latch on to any piece of evidence for it and just pretend like common sense doesn't exist, and it does.
It absolutely absolutely does. You talk about this slippery slope,
Mm-hmm.
and you mentioned Mario Rizzo, and I can't remember the other guy,
Glenn Whitman,
Glenn Whitman.
been
Yeah,
my friend for 30 years. If you're watching this, Glenn, how you doing, buddy?
and they wrote a book about this slippery slope, and they compared slippery slopes to bright lines.
Mm-hmm.
Elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, let's see. I could just go and do the examples from the book. So
That's fine.
before 1920, we had about 700 years where if you wanted to sue your neighbor for messing with your property, you had to actually show physical harm. So you've got this law of nuisance that says, if you're blowing large amounts of smoke on my property, I can sue you and I can get money out of you and make you stop. If you're making enormous amounts of noise, I can do that. If you've got a pig farm that's making horrible smells, I can do that. But until around 1920, you could not go and and really not only not to suing, but you also couldn't really have government regulation for purely aesthetic harms. Like, I don't like the color of your paint. I don't like that you've got a Israeli or Palestinian flag in front of your house. Right. So up until that time, the reasons that you could have to regulate or to sue were pretty limited. And then in the 1920s, before then, so cities started passing some ordinances, and they finally made their way to the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1920s. And then they said, oh yeah, like, actually an apartment kind of is a nuisance because of, well, like it like messes things up, and there's too many people around, and the schools could get crowded, that kind of thing. Right. But anyway, important to notice that in the early years of zoning, there wasn't an immediate big rise in housing prices, and the laws were not applied that strictly. And so it was totally possible to go and have the suburbanization of the US in the 40s and 50s. It didn't stop people from moving to California by the millions. So you could easily go and say, oh, all of your critics of regulation, you're just hyper, and it's not that big of a deal. And we can go and have a little bit of regulation that handles some severe problems without going and making housing prices sky high. But here's the thing. Once you allowed it, it's just started growing and growing and growing. If there had been a bright line, the Supreme Court had said no. Like, the bright line is physical harm. Physical harm, that's the only thing you can sue for. That's the only thing you can regulate. If it's not physical harm, then no, you just tough luck. You just have to live with it. Right? If they had drawn that bright line, we would not be here where we are today.
Okay, you used a word, a concept, and I consider myself to be pretty well read, and I've never heard this before, but I thought it
All
was
right.
very
Well,
good.
I'm intrigued. What's it going to be, Michael?
Consilience. And
Conciliate.
I thought it was very good because what you did is showed how the argument for deregulation should appeal to broad swaths of people.
Mm-hmm.
So just explain consilience and use the examples. Like you used egalitarians, utilitarians,
Mm-hmm.
libertarians, and the cost benefit analysis
Mm-hmm.
people. So
Mm-hmm.
explain consilience and how it applies to such seemingly disparate groups.
So consilience is the idea that you can reach the same conclusion from a lot of different ways, that the evidence all comes together in a way that's actually coherent. I think there was I think it was James Q. Wilson wrote a book called Consilience. Maybe I'm mixing it up. But anyway, so there's a book of this title, and it's on the theme of all these scientific results that all wind up fitting together very nicely. And it doesn't really matter where you start, you end up in the same place. This works for housing regulation, I say, or particularly housing deregulation. So look, there's a lot of different moral views in the world. There's utilitarians, egalitarians, libertarians. In economics, there's cost benefit analysis. Of course, there's a bunch of other views that I don't wind up discussing. And it's very tempting when you're not reaching a consensus for someone to say, well, it's just a matter of values. We just have different values. So we'll never agree. And what I try to argue in that chapter is there's almost no set of values from which, once you accept the facts, you shouldn't reach the same conclusion, more or less. How so? Well, the utilitarian case for housing deregulation is really clear. You greatly increase the wealth of mankind. You especially benefit the poor. Put that all together, and utilitarians are going to love it. But then there is another philosophy. So John Rawls's egalitarianism, which just says we should focus exclusively on the well-being of the least fortunate. And here's, all right, actually, that one's pretty easy too, because least fortunate people, they're going to be the poor, and housing deregulation is especially good for them. I mean, you might actually have a harder line saying, the least fortunate are really the homeless. And like, all right, housing deregulation is good for the homeless too. Get housing prices down, legalize flop houses. There's a lot of other ways in which the poor would be better off. So we got that too. For libertarians, like I said, this is a no-brainer. I think government shouldn't go and tell people how to use their property. Housing regulation tells people how to use their property. All right, let's get rid of it. And then finally, there's economist cost benefit analysis. This is probably the one that people know the least about. You do often hear about it from government did a cost benefit analysis. The main difference between cost benefit analysis and utilitarianism is that actual textbook cost benefit analysis doesn't care if you're rich or poor. So it counts all dollar gains equally, regardless of who is receiving them. So the Cost benefit case for deregulation is actually a bit weaker than the utilitarian case, but I still say it's plenty strong.
And you also use something you talk about in a little mini discussion you have with the economic journalist Tim Harford, where you talk about keyhole solutions. And this is kind of goes against the main thrust of the book, which is for full deregulation. And this allows for some, but you talk about if you're going to do it, it should be done based on this keyhole analogy. So what's that?
Yeah, so Tim Harford had this great analogy where he said, look, in the old days, we did surgery in a way where, first of all, obviously, it often harmed the patient. But in any case, there was very little attention that doctors used to pay to side effects. And is there some way that we could go and get the same job done with just a lot less pain and suffering, lower downside risks? You can see this very nicely in C-sections 50 years ago versus C-sections today. C-sections 50 years ago, you did a vertical cut, right? Now you do a horizontal cut. Not only is the scar much less visible for a modern C-section, but the recovery is easier. It's just a better process. Still gets the baby out, still protects the health of the mother, but you wind up having lower side effects because you were thinking, what can we do to get the collateral damage down? Harford then says that if government's going to go and regulate, it makes sense for them to apply the same logic. And by the way, this is called keyhole surgery because ideally you're doing an incision just big enough for a key, just small, like just big enough to get in our little camera inside of the patient, do the surgery, barely even cut them open. Like you could be an outpatient procedure if you're doing something small enough. Anyway, so they call that keyhole surgery. And they say, how about we have keyhole policies where we listen to people that are complaining about market outcomes and then try to do the cheapest, most humane regulation that handles the exact complaint without doing anything else. So for example, I say, look, if you're really worried about letting in a bunch of new people into your area because they're going to go and raise your property taxes or they're going to clog the schools, say, how about this? How about new people have to pay higher property taxes than old people? Or how about we just get rid of the property taxes on existing homeowners and put them all on the new people, right? And you may say that's not fair. So, well, compared to what? Is it fair compared to saying you can't build it at all? Last night I was on the radio and it was some story about when Maury Povich was mayor of somewhere or other. They were planning on tearing down some houses right next to an airport expansion. And then Maury Povich said, well, why don't we just make it a special community for the hearing impaired? And people just flipped out at him and said, that's terrible. And so they tore down the houses. It's like, wouldn't it have been better if you kept the houses there? And like, doesn't mean you have to live there, but it's like a way of having some extra housing for the hearing impaired, which would be an option. What's so bad about that?
And I suppose it would be better than not having it at all.
Yes, that is crucial. Yeah, so you're right. The thrust of the book is radical deregulation. In fact, I am more in favor of deregulation than I even said in the book because I wanted to focus on stuff where I had very good research to rely on. But when people push, like, what about building codes? Yeah, I'm against those too. Like the free market is a fine way to handle safety. At the best case scenario for government regulation is that government forces you to do a whole lot of safety, which does actually make people a little bit safer, but at high cost. And yeah, I think that it's better to leave that up to the market to make that trade-off. And if you wind up harming other people, then there's the last remedy of the lawsuit. But the main thing is that companies don't want to build buildings that collapse. Of course not. That's crazy to build a building that collapses.
Yeah, see, I'm in favor of deregulation also, but I would accept anything that moves in that direction.
Yes.
To say it's all or nothing. Either you're going to give me complete
of course, yeah.
That just seems dumb to me. Like,
yes,
why not?
It is indeed very dumb. Yeah, like so I am a researcher. I'm not someone who is running for office. So if someone asks me a hard question, I try to just give them a totally honest answer. So, like the idea that you want to have government regulation, make sure everything is as safe as possible. That's just the same nonsense we heard during COVID of if it saves one life. saves one life, we just keep society shut down again for another year. It's like, look, you can reduce your own risk. Just never drive anywhere, never leave the home, like for anything other than what's required for physical survival. Like that's safer, but it's terrible, and it's not a life well lived. A life well lived involves taking a whole lot of calculated risks so that you can enjoy life.
Now, there are some free market solutions, right? Because some people say one of the things I hear like are, well, what if somebody in a neighborhood wants to paint their house black or wants to put a
Mm,
strip club next to it, an elementary school, or open up a firing range in my backyard, that sort of thing. And my answer is, well, if it's their property, then they have as much right to do with it what they want as you do with yours. But there are actually free market solutions that don't include government force, and you talk about
mm,
some of them in here. So what can, like in Houston, I think they have
mm.
some of these. What are they and how do they work?
Yes. So in the case of the firing range, that is actually under the classic category of the law of nuisance, which has been around since like 1200 AD, where if they are physically impinging on your property, then you can go and sue them. All right. So that's sort of that is a bit different. You could say that's still the government or whatever, but it's very much in the general thinking of property rights. Like you can't go and uh, shoot me with a sonic death ray on my property and say it's just I'm just talking here. Right? Right. But anyway, but that aside, the really neat thing that you can see with Houston, because it doesn't have standard use zoning, separation of uses, is that there is a market logic that leads there to be a separation of uses, even if it's totally legal to go and put anything next to anything else. Bernard Segan explained it really elegantly. And if you just want to, if you're curious, like, could this really be true? I actually spent some time playing around with maps of Houston on Google Maps and just looking and seeing like what's next to what stuff. And Segan's right. So when you are doing manufacturing, you almost always want to put it next to ports or railroads because of transportation costs, of course. So there's a reason why manufacturing clusters together, which has nothing to do with government, and it's just the actual convenience. It's the best place to put it. You want to put your manufacturing next to railroads and docks. Similarly, when you're doing commercial properties, there's a reason you want to put them next to major roads because you want to get drive-by traffic. When you are building nice homes naturally go together because if you've got a vacant plot of land in Beverly Hills, you don't want to put shacks there. That's not the highest value use. People in shacks won't pay you much of a premium to live in Beverly Hills. You're going to go and put a mansion in Beverly Hills. Right. So there's this point that there's a natural separation of uses just driven by market forces. It's not perfect, but but the problem that we currently have is it's too perfect because there's a lot of cases where it makes sense to go and bend the rules a bit, or like, well, maybe in this case it would make sense to go and do it that way. Now, in the cases you were giving, like a strip club, do you want to put a strip club next to a school?
No,
The
I wouldn't
customers
know.
probably don't want it there either for obvious reasons. They don't want to get
Yeah.
recognized. It's embarrassing to have kids see you go into a strip club. So there's a reason why you're not going to put a strip club next to a school. Does this mean that would never happen? No, but it's going to be real rare that you're going to do something like that, and market forces alone do it. Now, if that's not enough, then also again we see this in Houston, but actually over most modern developments in the U.S., you can also have a homeowners association where the developer, when they create all of the properties, they sell them with a condition that you have to belong to this organization. If you sell, you have to also impose a resale requirement that the new owner has to belong to this organization. And then the organization has rules about what you can and can't do with your property. But a key part is this is a property rights solution to a property rights problem. Now, how is this better than regulation? Well, if you want to be philosophical, it's like, well, this is imposed with unanimous consent. You don't just say everybody has to follow these rules whether you like it or not. This is one where there's an original owner and every single person that it takes part actually individually promised to follow these rules. That's philosophical, but the actual more functional point is that when you have homeowners associations doing it, you get variation. Right? If you want a pink house, you could either go to a place that doesn't have the HOA, or you can find a more relaxed one. A homeowners association, I know that they're not perfect, they got problems, but at least they've got some variation, and there's some reason for them to go and consider the cost of the rules compared to the benefits, whereas governments really seem to be almost entirely ruled by the biggest complainer.
You've mentioned the word perfect a few times, and it seems to me that in a lot of these discussions and debates I've had about topics like this, is instead of starting with what we actually have, people set up this perfect world in their heads,
Mhm.
and then anything that deviates from that,
Mhm.
like you said, they might put a strip club next to a school. It's unlikely. There's no economic
Mhm.
incentive to do so. But the people say, well, it might happen, and if that happens, how horrible it would be. But what do we have now when we have
Mhm.
zoning regulations, when we have high taxes on building? Is you end up with these higher costs, increased inequalities, like you said, increased crime. But that's not
Mhm.
taken into consideration. It's just this perfection that they're able to
Mhm.
visualize.
And a lot of it is this desire for what is appropriately called pseudo certainty. A pseudo certainty, it's fake certainty. How is it fake? It's like say, well, look, as long as there's a law, then it won't happen. Like, are you crazy? Laws get broken all the time. You broke a bunch of laws today. There's the Twitter account, crime a day. Everyone's breaking laws all the time because there's just too many laws to follow and they're so inconvenient. Everybody speeds. Everyone. If you're on the road, you need to speed. If you didn't speed, you'd be in mortal danger in many
You
cases.
would.
So the fact that there's a law in the books doesn't show that something can't happen, that there's no guarantee from a law. And even if there was a guarantee, it's like, well, fine, it's guaranteed, but at what cost? What if this is going to be the $1 billion strip club that's going to revolutionize an industry? Right? And then there's one school with 3 kids in it, and like, so we should go and destroy $1 billion firm for the sake of a school with 3 kids? That does not make sense. And if you say, well, education is always more important than mere pleasure, it's like, that sounds a lot like that COVID nonsense of it saves one life.
It
Like,
does.
that's a
It
mentality
does.
for a life of abject misery. It is very important to let people make trade offs between safety and other goods. And as to why strip clubs get singled out for being uniquely evil, I mean, this is one where honestly, when I look at the modern world, I say, look, you know what? I'm not worried about teens having sex anymore. I'm worried about them never having sex. I'm worried about human loneliness. This is what actually haunts my darkest thoughts: is a world where people no longer connect with each other. Like, it's like, yeah, like the problems that people talked about in the 80s, they just seem quaint by comparison.
You got a good point. It seems like when I was a teenager, first of all, they've changed all these driving laws. So
Mhm.
kids can't drive around in cars together. Whereas when I was 16 or
Yeah.
even younger, I had older friends. We'd be driving around, meeting up with other kids. They don't do that anymore.
Mhm.
They've got their, gadgets and whatnot. They're staying home, they're texting and group
Mhm.
chats or whatever. But recently, not that recent, a year and a half ago, I walked through my old neighborhood. When I was a little kid, you growing up, we'd be out in the street playing football, baseball, what we'd be fighting. That was something. But this neighborhood was empty. There was
Mhm.
no kids doing anything. And I wherever I go, that's something I very rarely see are
Mhm.
kids congregating, doing anything.
Mhm.
When I went to Burger King recently, I think it was a Friday, and they're there with their laptops. And I'm just thinking there was maybe 4 kids. I was thinking when I was a teenager, we packed Burger King on a Friday night, but that just doesn't happen. So I think you're
Mhm.
right there with we
Mhm.
need to update our concerns a
Mhm.
little bit.
Yeah, if you want to see something to put a smile on your face, go to, particularly, I mean, it's probably work in other places too, but Palermo, Italy. In Palermo, Italy, if you just walk around, you'll see groups of 30 teenagers just going together. Like, are they a team? What are they? Like, no, it's just like, in out of town, the teenagers, they congregate and they go places together. Like 30 kids. Like I was even asking my local friends, like, how does it happen? Like, it's like, is there a meeting place? Like, no, it just happens. There's no a plan. It's like, wow, this is definitely a very different culture here.
Yeah. All right, Brian, before I let you go, is there anything that I didn't ask you that I should have or that you'd like to cover that we didn't?
Hmm. I think that probably the main thing that I just want to add is this. Libertarians talk about a lot of policy issues, and I find that often they'll get fixated on ones where when you really look at the numbers, it's like, well, look, you're right that this is a bad policy, but it's not one that in a lifetime would even make sense to really complain about because there's so many bigger things. A lot of what I'm trying to do with my work is to find the really big, horrible things government is doing. Just by the math, by the numbers, because to me, a big part of what's exciting about libertarian ideas is the world could be way better than it currently is. And if all you've got is, well, like, there's a 3% tax in this thing, it's like, all right, we get rid of it, sure, but it doesn't make things that much better. You might even barely notice. Deregulating housing is something where if it happens, you'll know it. You will just see, wow, like there's enormous amount of construction. The whole economy is transforming if we do this. There's a giant increase in construction employment for non-college males. We've got young people can suddenly afford to get their own place right out of high school. We've got new cities forming. I've got a post where I saw in the book, I actually forgot to talk about this, but I did a blog post on, I should have also talked about privatizing federal land. If you could do this, then Elon Musk could go and build a totally new city in a currently uninhabited area. These are all the different things that we are losing from regulation. And it's a major difference between the world today and a world where government gets the hell out of the way. So, and if we don't have that, then I don't think we've got something exciting to sell to the world.
Let's get the government the hell out of the way. I'm all for it. All right, Bryan, where can they find your book and where can they find you?
The book is basically everywhere that you can buy books. I do Amazon, but if you do something else, good for you. Should be in Barnes & Noble too. In terms of where you can find me, so my website's bcaplan.com, and I have a Substack, which is called Bet On It.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, Bryan.
Awesome. And yeah, also I've got a YouTube channel with, like, at this point, hundreds of videos on 10, 15 different topics, including my previous interview with you, Michael.
Awesome. 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 All right. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.